Catherine had spent 20 years convincing herself that Michael was gone. She had buried the grief, forced herself to move forward, and learned to live with the unanswered questions. But when she found an old photograph buried in a box of forgotten memories, everything she thought she knew shattered in an instant. Because in the background of that picture, watching them from a few tables away, was a man who looked exactly like her husband, only 20 years older. Catherine Wilson had never believed in the idea that someone could simply vanish without a trace. People always left something behind, a clue, a witness, a mistake. But when her husband, Michael, disappeared 20 years ago, it was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. It started as an ordinary day. Michael had kissed her on the forehead that morning, just like he always did. He had told her he had an important meeting at work, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out the door. There was nothing unusual about his behavior. No tension in his voice. No hesitation in his steps. He had left like any other morning, like he would be back in the evening, ready to tell her about his day. But he never came home. At first, she wasn't worried. Maybe the meeting had run late. Maybe he had stopped somewhere without calling. By midnight, worry gnawed at her stomach. By sunrise, fear had taken its place. She called his office, but his colleagues hadn't seen him since the day before. She called the police, expecting them to tell her she was overreacting. Instead, they took the case seriously. A missing persons report was filed. Officers came to the house, asked her questions about their marriage, their finances, whether he had any reason to leave. She told them the truth. They were happy. There were no debts, no affairs, no secrets. At least, none that she knew of. Days turned into weeks. The police checked his bank accounts, his phone records, his credit cards. Nothing. His car was missing, but there were no reports of it being abandoned or stolen. It was as if Michael had simply walked off the face of the earth. For months, she lived in a cycle of hope and despair. Every time the phone rang, she held her breath, thinking it would be him. Every time the police called, she braced herself for answers. But the only thing they ever told her was that there was nothing to tell. No body. No ransom note. No evidence of foul play. Just silence. People around her eventually moved on. They stopped asking if she had heard anything. They stopped expecting her to find closure. Some even suggested that Michael had left on purpose, that maybe he had wanted to disappear. The idea enraged her. Michael wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a coward. He would never have abandoned her like that. But the years passed, and she had to find a way to live again. She sold their house, moved to a smaller place, and tried to rebuild a life that no longer included him. Eventually, she had him declared legally dead. It was the only way to close accounts, to settle what little was left of his existence. On paper, he no longer existed. But in her heart, he never really left. Even now, 20 years later, she still dreamed about him. She still imagined him walking through the front door, smiling like nothing had happened. She still caught herself turning her head when she saw someone in a crowd who looked like him. And then, one evening, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, she found a photograph. At first, she smiled. It was a picture of them, taken a month before he disappeared. They had been at a small seaside restaurant, sitting close together, his arm around her shoulders. They had been happy that day. She could almost hear his voice, feel the warmth of his hand against hers. Then she looked closer. Something in the background caught her eye. A man sitting at a table behind them. He was wearing dark sunglasses, but his face was angled just enough that she could see his features. He was staring directly at the camera. Her breath caught in her throat. The man looked exactly like Michael. But older. Her hand started to tremble as she brought the photo closer to her face. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The same strong jawline. The same slight curve of his nose. The same expression he always had when he was lost in thought. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had spent 20 years wondering what had happened to him, 20 years trying to accept that he was gone. But now, staring at this photograph, one terrifying thought took hold in her mind. What if he had never really left? Catherine sat frozen in the attic, the old photograph trembling in her hands. Her mind raced as she stared at the face in the background. It couldn't be real. It had to be a coincidence. A trick of the light. A stranger who just happened to look like Michael. But the longer she looked, the harder it became to convince herself. The attic was dimly lit, dust floating in the air, the scent of old paper and forgotten belongings surrounding her. The photograph had been buried in a box she hadn't opened in years. She had gone through so many of their old things over time, sorting, donating, trying to move forward. But somehow, this particular box had escaped her attention. She traced her fingers over the image, her pulse pounding in her ears. The restaurant in the picture was familiar. It was the little seaside cafe they had visited just a month before he vanished. She remembered the salty breeze, the warmth of his hand on hers, the way he had laughed at something she had said. She had never imagined that day would hold any significance beyond being another happy memory. But now, looking at this photo, she saw something she had never noticed before. Michael, or whoever this man was, had been there. Not just with her, but watching her. The older version of him, sitting a few tables away, unnoticed, blending into the background. Her stomach twisted. She wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but something inside her screamed that this was more than just a trick of her imagination. She needed answers. She grabbed her phone and took a picture of the photograph, zooming in on the man's face. She had no idea what she was looking for, but she had to do something. She ran a reverse image search online, but nothing came up. No matches, no records, nothing to suggest that this man existed outside of this one captured moment. Her hands felt clammy as she picked up the phone again. She hesitated before dialing, staring at the number on the screen. It had been years since she had last spoken to Detective Mark Reynolds, the officer who had handled Michael's case in the early days. She didn't know if he was still working or if he would even remember her. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. Reynolds. She swallowed hard. Detective Reynolds, it's Catherine Wilson. There was a pause. Then his tone softened slightly. Catherine. It's been a long time. I know, she said, gripping the phone tighter. I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important. Another pause. What's going on? She looked down at the photograph again, her heart racing. I found something. Something that might change everything. She could hear the skepticism in his silence. He had spent years chasing leads that went nowhere. He had tried to find Michael, just like she had, but eventually, he had accepted what she couldn't. That Michael was gone. She took a deep breath. I found an old photo from just before he disappeared. And in the background. I swear to God, there's a man who looks exactly like him. Only older. Reynolds sighed. Catherine. I know how it sounds, she cut in. But I need someone to look at this with fresh eyes. Someone who won't just dismiss it. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, send me the photo. She quickly texted it to him and waited, biting her lip as she imagined what he would say. Minutes passed before her phone buzzed with his response. Where was this taken? She exhaled sharply. He saw it too. That little seafood place by the coast. The one Michael loved. Another pause. Meet me tomorrow at my office, he said. And bring the original. She hung up, her hands shaking. She should have felt relief that he was taking her seriously, but instead, anxiety settled deep in her chest. If Michael had really been there that day, if he had been close enough to see her, close enough to be in that photograph, then the biggest question wasn't just where he had gone. It was why he had left at all. Catherine barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the photograph in her mind. The younger version of herself, smiling, unaware. Michael beside her, laughing. And in the background, the man who looked just like him, staring at them. She tried to convince herself that it was impossible. People didn't just disappear for 20 years and then turn up in old photographs. But no matter how many times she tried to rationalize it, the feeling in her gut told her something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a long time. The next morning, she left the house early. The original photograph was carefully placed in an envelope inside her purse. Her fingers twitched with anxiety as she drove across town to meet Detective Reynolds. The city had changed over the years, but some things remained the same: the way the morning traffic crawled along Main Street, the way the sidewalks were filled with people rushing to work, the way certain buildings still stood as if time had barely touched them. Reynolds' office was in a small, outdated police station on the west side of town. The walls were yellowed with age, the floors scuffed from years of officers coming and going. She remembered sitting here 20 years ago, holding on to hope that the next lead would bring Michael home. She had waited in this very office for hours, clinging to the belief that someone, somewhere, had the answers. Now she was back, but this time, she wasn't looking for closure. She was looking for the truth. Reynolds was waiting for her at his desk. He looked older than she remembered, his hair grayer, his face lined with the weight of years spent chasing cases that often led nowhere. He gestured for her to sit, his eyes already focused on the envelope in her hands. "You have the original?" he asked. She nodded and carefully pulled out the photograph, placing it on his desk. He studied it in silence, his fingers tracing the edge of the image as he leaned in closer. His eyes narrowed as he focused on the man in the background. After a long moment, he exhaled. "Damn." Catherine's heart pounded. "You see it too?" He didn't look up. "It's not just a resemblance. It's him." A chill ran down her spine. She had been prepared for him to dismiss her concerns, to tell her she was seeing what she wanted to see. But he wasn't doing that. He was confirming what she had been afraid to admit. She swallowed hard. "Then where has he been all these years?" Reynolds finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "That's what we need to find out." She gripped the arms of the chair, trying to steady herself. "You investigated his case. You went through everything. How could we have missed this?" Reynolds leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "Because we were looking in the wrong places. If this was taken before he disappeared, and if that's really him, then he wasn't just some missing person. He was watching you." The words sent a shiver through her body. She had spent years grieving, wondering if he had been hurt, if he had been taken against his will. But if he had been sitting there that day, looking older than he should have been, it meant something entirely different. It meant he had left on purpose. Her voice was barely a whisper. Why would he do that? Reynolds studied her carefully. "That's the question, isn't it?" She took a deep breath, trying to push away the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "What do we do next?" He tapped the photograph. "We start with the restaurant. Someone there might remember something." She nodded, gripping her purse tighter. She had spent 20 years accepting that Michael was gone. Now, for the first time, she had a real chance of finding out what had happened. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for the answer. The drive to the restaurant felt longer than it should have. Catherine gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she navigated the familiar roads. She hadn't been back to that place in years. It had once been her favorite little escape, a hidden gem where she and Michael would sit for hours, talking about their dreams, their plans, their future. But after he disappeared, she could never bring herself to go back. Now she was heading there with a detective, chasing a ghost that had resurfaced from the past. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the possibility that she would find nothing or the possibility that she would find something she wasn't ready to know. Reynolds sat beside her, flipping through an old notebook. He had gone back through the original case files before they left. There was nothing in them about the restaurant. No reports, no witness statements from that night. "When you first reported Michael missing," Reynolds said, his voice calm but firm, "you never mentioned this place." "Why?" She kept her eyes on the road. "Because it didn't seem important. It was just another night. We had dinner, we laughed, we went home. There was nothing unusual about it." Reynolds glanced at the photograph again. "Except there was." She swallowed hard. "I didn't see him there that night. If I had, would have remembered." Reynolds nodded but didn't say anything. She could feel his skepticism. If the man in the background was truly Michael, then it meant he had been there, watching them. It meant he had already known something was coming. The restaurant appeared ahead, looking almost exactly the same as it had all those years ago. The white and blue awning was slightly faded, and the sign above the entrance had been replaced, but everything else was unchanged. The small patio still faced the water, the same wooden tables still lined up near the edge. Catherine pulled into the parking lot, taking a deep breath before stepping out. The salty air hit her immediately, bringing back memories she wasn't sure she wanted to relive. Reynolds followed her inside. The restaurant was quiet, the lunchtime rush still an hour away. A middle-aged man stood behind the counter, wiping down a glass. He looked up as they entered, his eyes scanning them with casual curiosity. Catherine approached first. "Excuse me, are you the owner?" The man nodded. "That's me. Mark Jennings. What can I do for you?" She hesitated, unsure how to even begin. Reynolds took over. "We're looking for information about a night that happened a long time ago. We were hoping you might have some old records, maybe even video footage." Jennings raised an eyebrow. "How long ago?" Catherine pulled out the photograph, placing it on the counter. 20 years. Jennings exhaled, shaking his head. "That's a long time. We didn't even have digital security cameras back then, just an old tape system. I doubt anything survived." Reynolds leaned forward. "Even old reservation logs? Employee schedules?" Jennings glanced at the photograph. His eyes lingered on the man in the background before he frowned. "Wait a minute. I remember this guy." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. "You do?" Jennings nodded slowly. "Yeah. He wasn't a regular, but I saw him a few times back then. Always came in alone, never ordered much, just sat there. I remember because he always took the same table, the one in the back corner." Catherine's hands clenched. "Did he ever talk to anyone?" Jennings thought for a moment. "Not really. He mostly kept to himself. But there was one time. I remember thinking it was strange." Reynolds straightened. "What happened?" Jennings rubbed the back of his neck. "One night, I saw him talking to a man in a suit. It wasn't casual. It looked serious, like they were arguing about something. I didn't hear what they were saying, but it felt tense." Catherine's stomach twisted. "Do you remember what the other man looked like?" Jennings shook his head. "Not really. He had dark hair, expensive-looking suit, but that's all I got." Reynolds pulled out a notepad. "Was this before or after the night in this photo?" Jennings studied the image again, then nodded. "Before. Maybe a few weeks before." Catherine felt dizzy. If Michael had met with someone in secret, if he had been having serious conversations with strangers, then it meant he had been involved in something she never knew about. Jennings sighed. "I wish I could help more, but 20 years is a long time." I barely remember last week. Catherine forced a smile. You've helped more than you know. They left the restaurant in silence. The sun was bright, but Catherine felt cold. She turned to Reynolds, her voice unsteady. He wasn't just taken, was he? Reynolds looked at her carefully. It's starting to look like he left. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment. She had spent years grieving a man she thought was lost. But now, she was beginning to realize something far worse. Michael hadn't been taken from her. Michael had been hiding from her. The drive back from the restaurant was silent. Catherine gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white as she replayed everything Mark Jennings had said. Michael had been there. He had sat in that restaurant, not once, but multiple times. He had met with someone. It hadn't been casual. It had been serious. Reynolds sat beside her, his notepad resting on his knee. She could feel him watching her, waiting for her to speak, but she didn't know what to say. Her thoughts were tangled, emotions pulling her in different directions. She had spent 20 years believing Michael had been taken from her, stolen by some unknown force, leaving her with nothing but questions. Now, for the first time, she had to face a different possibility. Michael had left on his own. She pulled up to her house, turning off the engine but making no move to get out. The weight of everything pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Reynolds finally broke the silence. You need to prepare yourself for what we might find, he said. His voice was steady, calm, but there was an edge to it. She turned to him, her eyes burning. What does that mean? Reynolds leaned back slightly, choosing his words carefully. If he walked away from his life, from you, there's a reason. People don't just disappear for 20 years without one. Catherine swallowed hard. What if it wasn't his choice? Reynolds exhaled slowly. Then we need to prove it. She pushed open the door, stepping out into the cool air. She felt lightheaded, unsteady, as if she were walking through a dream she couldn't wake up from. Reynolds followed her inside, and she went straight to the kitchen, setting her purse down on the counter. The photograph was still inside, but she didn't need to look at it again. It was burned into her mind. She turned to Reynolds. Where do we start? He crossed his arms. The man he met with at the restaurant. If we can figure out who he was, we might get some answers. She rubbed her temples. Jennings barely remembered anything. Just that he had dark hair and wore a suit. Reynolds pulled out his phone. I'll see if I can track down any old employees who worked there back then. Maybe someone else remembers more. Catherine nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. She couldn't just sit and wait. She needed to do something. She grabbed her laptop and sat at the dining table, her fingers hovering over the keys. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she typed Michael Wilson missing person case into the search bar. The results were the same as they had always been. Old news articles, missing person reports, a few mentions in forums where people speculated about what might have happened to him. But nothing new. She changed her search. Michael Wilson sighting. At first, the results were useless. But then, something caught her eye. It was a post from a small online forum, dated 5 years ago. A user had posted a blurry image of a man sitting outside a cafe in Mexico. The caption read, "Saw this guy today. Looks exactly like the man who disappeared 20 years ago. Michael Wilson. Could it be him?" Catherine's hands shook as she clicked on the post. The image wasn't clear, but her breath caught in her throat. Even through the grainy resolution, she recognized the face. The hair was grayer, the lines on his face deeper. But it was him. She stared at the post, her pulse hammering in her ears. Someone had seen him. He had been alive 5 years ago. He had been out in the open. Reynolds leaned over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing. Where was this taken? She scrolled down. The comments were filled with people speculating, arguing over whether it was really Michael. Then, near the bottom, a reply from the original poster, taken in Tulum. He left before I could talk to him. Catherine turned to Reynolds, her voice barely above a whisper. He's alive. Reynolds nodded slowly. And now we know where to start looking. Catherine's heart pounded. For the first time in 20 years, Michael wasn't just a memory. He wasn't just a missing person. He was real. And she was going to find him. The drive back from the restaurant was silent. Catherine stared out the window, her mind racing through everything she had just seen. The grainy footage of the man in the background haunted her. It wasn't just his resemblance to Michael that unsettled her, it was the way he had been watching them. He hadn't just been another customer. He had been there for a reason. Reynolds drove with his usual quiet focus, but she could tell he was processing it all too. He had been skeptical when she first showed him the photograph, but now, he was just as invested in finding answers as she was. Finally, she broke the silence. If that was Michael, if he was there that night, watching us, why wouldn't he have said something? Reynolds kept his eyes on the road. Because he didn't want you to know he was there. The words made her stomach turn. She had spent years grieving, imagining terrible fates that could have befallen him. But what if he had never been in danger? What if he had simply left? She swallowed hard. So what now? Reynolds tapped his fingers against the steering wheel. That man in the suit. The one the restaurant owner mentioned. He's the missing link. If we can find out who he was, we might finally understand what Michael was caught up in. Catherine took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. How do we do that? Reynolds hesitated for a moment before answering. We start by looking into Michael's financial records. She turned to him sharply. They already did that. The police, the private investigators I hired. There was nothing suspicious. No sudden withdrawals, no hidden accounts. Reynolds nodded. I know. But they were looking for the kind of signs you'd expect from someone who was either kidnapped or trying to disappear suddenly. What if he was planning his disappearance for a long time? What if he was moving money carefully, in small amounts, over months or even years? Catherine felt a chill go through her. She had never considered that. You think he planned to leave? Reynolds sighed. I don't know what to think yet. But if he did, then he wasn't just running from something. He was running toward something. The weight of that statement settled heavily in her chest. If Michael had planned this, it meant he had lied to her for years. It meant every late-night conversation, every promise they had made to each other had been built on something false. Reynolds glanced at her. Are you ready for this? Catherine let out a shaky breath. I don't know. But I have to know the truth. They spent the rest of the day at Reynolds' office, poring over old financial statements. It was tedious work, sifting through decades-old records, but Catherine refused to give up. Hours passed before Reynolds suddenly sat up straighter. He pointed at one of the documents. Look at this. Catherine leaned over, her heart pounding. At first, it looked like an ordinary withdrawal. A small amount of money taken out of their joint account. Then another, 2 weeks later. Then another. The pattern was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. Reynolds met her gaze. He was siphoning money. Slowly. Carefully. Catherine felt like she couldn't breathe. For how long? Reynolds scanned the documents. Almost 2 years. Her stomach twisted. 2 years. That meant Michael had started this long before he disappeared. Long before she had any reason to suspect anything was wrong. She gripped the edge of the desk. Where was the money going? Reynolds flipped through more pages, searching for answers. Then he stopped. There was a transaction. A transfer to a name she didn't recognize. She frowned. Who is that? Reynolds pulled up a search on his computer. When the results loaded, his face darkened. The name belonged to a man who had been investigated for money laundering, fraud, and organized crime. Catherine felt her blood run cold. Michael hadn't just disappeared. He had been running from something much bigger than she had ever imagined. Catherine felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. The name on the transaction report meant nothing to her, but the crimes associated with it sent a chill through her body. Fraud. Money laundering. Organized crime. These were not things that had any place in the life she had shared with Michael. Or at least, she had always believed that. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. This changes everything. Catherine shook her head, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. No. Michael wasn't involved in anything illegal. He wasn't that kind of person. Reynolds exhaled, rubbing his temple. I'm not saying he was a criminal, but look at the facts. He had been moving money for 2 years, quietly, in small amounts. The transactions led to someone who was under investigation for fraud and money laundering. That doesn't happen by accident. Catherine swallowed hard, her throat dry. Then explain why he would do it. Explain why he would have been sitting in that restaurant, watching us, looking older than he should have been. Reynolds didn't answer right away. He tapped his fingers against the desk, deep in thought. Maybe he got involved with the wrong people. Maybe he was in over his head and didn't know how to get out. Catherine's mind raced. Had there been signs? Late nights at the office? Strange phone calls? She had never once suspected Michael of keeping secrets, but now she was questioning everything. She reached for the transaction record. There has to be more. This can't be the only trail he left behind. Reynolds nodded and turned back to his computer, searching for any additional links to the name they had found. Catherine leaned over his shoulder, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. After a few minutes, he clicked on a new document. A list of businesses appeared on the screen. Some legitimate. Some under investigation. And then, one that made Catherine's breath catch in her throat. It was a rental property. A small house in a quiet town 2 hours away. She pointed at the screen. That's it. That's where we need to go. Reynolds hesitated. We don't know if he's there. Catherine turned to him, her voice firm. Then we find out. She couldn't wait any longer. She had spent 20 years believing Michael was dead, 20 years grieving, 20 years questioning why he had left. Now, she was closer than ever to finding the truth. And she wasn't leaving without answers. The drive to the small town felt endless. Catherine gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she focused on the road ahead. The sun had already begun to set, casting a warm orange glow over the horizon, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were consumed by one thing, Michael. Reynolds sat beside her, his expression unreadable. He had been quiet for most of the drive, only speaking when necessary. She knew he was trying to manage her expectations. He had warned her that just because Michael had been connected to this house didn't mean he was still there. But she couldn't let herself believe that. Not after everything they had uncovered. The town was quiet, almost eerily so. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where strangers stood out. The house they were looking for was on the outskirts, a small, unremarkable structure with a weathered fence and a front porch that sagged slightly. It wasn't the kind of place she would have imagined Michael living. But then again, she didn't know what to imagine anymore. She parked on the side of the road, her hands shaking as she turned off the engine. The weight of what she was about to do settled deep in her chest. Reynolds exhaled. Are you ready for this? She wasn't. But she nodded anyway. They stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. Catherine could feel her pulse in her throat as they approached the house. The windows were dark. The front door was closed. There was no sign of movement inside. Reynolds knocked. The sound echoed in the still evening air. Catherine held her breath. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Catherine felt panic rising. What if they were too late? What if he had already left? Then, just as she was about to speak, the doorknob turned. The door opened slowly, revealing a man. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Michael. But he wasn't the man she had lost 20 years ago. He was older, his hair grayer, his face lined with years of a life she hadn't been a part of. His eyes widened the moment he saw her, his hand gripping the edge of the door as if steadying himself. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, barely above a whisper, he said her name. Catherine? Her knees nearly buckled. She had dreamed of this moment, imagined what she would say if she ever saw him again. But now, standing in front of him, she could barely breathe. Reynolds stepped forward. Michael Wilson? Michael's gaze flickered to him before returning to her. There was pain in his eyes, regret, something else she couldn't quite read. She forced herself to speak. You're alive. His jaw tightened. I never wanted you to find me. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. After all these years, after all the grief, all the questions, this was his response. Anger, hurt, confusion all swirled inside her. You left. You let me believe you were dead. Michael exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I didn't have a choice. Catherine shook her head. No. You did. You made a choice, and you chose to leave me. He looked away for a moment, his expression tortured. If I had stayed, you would have been in danger. I had to disappear. Reynolds crossed his arms. Disappear from what? Michael hesitated. Then, finally, he spoke. I got involved with the wrong people. At first, it was nothing serious. A few business deals, some favors. But then I realized who I was dealing with. By the time I wanted out, it was too late. They made it clear that if I didn't do what they wanted, they'd come after me. Or worse, they'd come after Catherine. Catherine's breath hitched. Michael's voice was quiet, filled with a pain she had never heard before. The only way to keep you safe was to make sure they thought I was gone. For good. She felt like the ground beneath her was shifting. Everything she had believed, every scenario she had imagined, it had never been this. Tears burned in her eyes. 20 years, Michael. You let me grieve you for 20 years. His face crumpled. I thought it was the only way. Silence stretched between them. Catherine didn't know how to process it all. She had spent 2 decades mourning a man who had been alive the entire time. A man who had chosen to leave for what he believed was her safety. Reynolds cleared his throat. Who were they? Michael shook his head. They're gone now. The people I ran from, most of them are either in prison or dead. That's why I stopped hiding. But I never planned for this. I never thought you'd find me. Catherine wiped at her face, her emotions raw. And what now? Michael looked at her, something desperate in his eyes. That's up to you. She didn't know how to answer. She had spent 20 years searching for closure, and now she had found him. But closure wasn't as simple as knowing the truth. The truth had torn them apart once. Could it bring them back together? She didn't know. But for the first time in 20 years, she had a choice. The ending of Catherine and Michael's story is not the kind that ties everything up neatly. It's not about a perfect reunion or easy forgiveness. It's about choices, consequences, and the weight of time. For 20 years, Catherine lived with grief, believing she had lost the love of her life. But in reality, Michael had been out there, carrying his own version of suffering, one built on fear, regret, and the belief that disappearing was the only way to protect her. When they finally stood face to face again, neither of them were the same people they had been before. The real question the story leaves us with is not just whether Catherine can forgive Michael, but whether they can rebuild anything from the ashes of what was lost. Can love survive 2 decades of absence, even if it was built on good intentions? Can the truth, no matter how painful, be enough to reconnect them? In the end, the story doesn't force an answer. It leaves Catherine with something she hasn't had in 20 years, a choice. Not the choice to chase the past, but to decide what her future will be. Whether that future includes Michael or not is up to her, and in a way, that makes this ending more powerful than a simple reconciliation ever could. It's not about going back. It's about deciding what comes next.